Thank you very much for coming. This is always when I have a crowd here, it kind of gives me a good incentive to keep going or maybe try something new. Um, this is my latest collection, and I want to tell you a little bit about how it all started and why it ended up being a fat book that I hadn't intended it to be. Okay, I got it. Okay. Because for those of you who don't know, I started out many years ago, over 50, but don't tell anybody, uh, just tracing my family history. This all started when I had my first child, and uh, I happen to have a father who's a great storyteller. And so um, I wanted to write down all of his stories to save them for my newborn because I knew I wouldn't be able to remember them all. And pretty soon I'm asking, well, who's Aunt Kate? Or how many siblings did my grandmother have? My grandma was one of 11. My dad was one of 13, so I had a lot of people to collect. And that's when I started. And within a year, I thought I was a pro, and I published my first book on my Mahoney family. It's an embarrassment to me. I really thought of bringing a copy of that first one. And I thought, oh my God, no, it's 20 pages. It's in one of those little folders where you you just put your pages in and fold them back. And oh, it's pretty. But that's how I started. And I started collecting. And actually, on my very first research project, I had the opportunity to jump down my first rabbit hole because as you're researching, I'm researching my family, and all of a sudden, as you're reading the microfilm, a very unique, different kind of story will pop up that you just have to read. And so my aunts had always told me, please, can you find out when our Grandpa Mahoney died? They didn't know when their grandpa died. All they knew was he was killed in a railroad accident because he worked for the railroad here. So as I'm reading the microfilm, I spotted a very interesting story about a breakthrough, a big scientific discovery that had been made this is 1906, because my aunt remembered Grandpa was killed the same year as the San Francisco earthquake. So at least I could narrow it down in my research. And I thought, a breakthrough. These scientists have discovered that they can predict when you're going to go insane, if you're going to go insane. Uh-oh. And it's like, I had to keep reading. And it's like, oh my gosh. Anybody who cannot resist driving their car more than 25 miles an hour is going to go insane. That was the big banner headline. So that was my first story that I just have to collect and remember. And that happened because I like the unique or the funny. And so I ended up with quite a collection. The other story that had me collecting is the fact that my dad always claimed he was the very first baby baptized in the new St. Joe's that was built after the fire. And at the time, I didn't focus on the fire. It's just, okay, Dad's the first baby in the new church, and I kept on. But pretty soon, several years later, I went back and thought, well, I wonder what the fire was all about. And at the time, there were 2 daily newspapers in Fond du Lac. So I went and read the first week of each newspaper after the fire. And I discovered each one of those newspapers had a minimum of 50 stories on the fire in 1 week's time. So I had over 100, and I copied, I printed out every single one of those stories because I wanted to get the full story of the whole fire. And that eventually led to, that was one story that I could actually write a full book about, the night the churches burned, because it was so, I guess I wasn't surprised to hear that people complained about the Fond du Lac government. Why didn't they order a new pump so that we had better water pressure at the fire? Or they didn't do this and they didn't do that. And it's like, whoa, that sounds like today. Everybody is complaining about everything and they don't do much about it or they didn't check to discover, hey, the city a month earlier had ordered a new pump. It just hadn't arrived yet. And it wasn't lack of water pressure. It was the fact that they had 6 buildings in a row all on fire at the same time, and they were attaching all their hoses to the same water line. So every time they attached another hose, the pressure went down, and then they'd hook another hose up and it went down again. It wasn't until they realized, hey, we should maybe go over to Ellis and attach some water hoses that they realized what the problem was. And the fact that T.E. Ahern downtown Maine had their water pipes burst because the pressure really was that high and damaged some of their goods. All those little stories are the hidden stories in all of those articles that I went through. And so that's one time. And I've only had one other time where I had a rabbit hole that was worthy of a whole book all by itself. My family always knew that I had a great great uncle who died in Alaska during the gold rush. And so once, thank goodness that I'm still here to enjoy the internet age and all the great programs you can get, and you can access newspaper clippings. And that's when I discovered that the story our family had about his death in Alaska was in no way the real story of what happened. And it was a magnificent story of the rescue and what happened and attempted murder and a whole bunch more things going on. That was one out of 55 years. I found 2 stories that were worth a whole book by themselves. Well, that was it. This is what I ended up in 55 years. It's a good sign of what I've accumulated in 55 years. And like I said, I'm glad I'm in the internet age. I save all my stories, all my oddball stories that I wasn't looking for, and any photos, things like that. I save them on an external hard drive. So it's not mixed with my software or my operating system on my computer. But I took a look at it the other day when I was prepping this program to see just how much space all these extra stories that I've collected really take up. And I have here, this is an example. I bring my talks. Thank goodness they make wonderful little zip drives. This zip drive holds 16 gigabytes. That was really a lot of data for most people. But if I had to save all my stuff, I need 34 of these. That's how much data I have collected. And so the end result, I decided it was time that I put all of these stories in one place, because almost all of these stories are the forgotten stories, the things that we don't remember. And a case in point is, how many of you know the name of the man credited with starting the railroad yards in North Fond du Lac? I feel that that's kind of frustrating to me, that man saved Fond du Lac from going downhill and becoming almost a ghost town because he brought jobs when Fond du Lac really needed them. So that's my collection. They're mostly forgotten stories. But of course, here's my disclaimer. We don't have time to go through almost 100 stories tonight. But they're really neat stories of Fond du Lac, so I'm going to try and go through as many as I can, or at least give you a sense of what some of the stories are about and some of the things that have been forgotten about Fond du Lac. when I put the stories together or started collecting them, they kind of fell into 5 different categories. Early Fond du Lac, that includes the Pyre family, Governor Talmadge, we've heard of him, uh, actually, and a lot of the early period of the pioneers. I also have a full collection. Most people don't realize I collected what I call the leather because of roofing leather. Most people don't realize how much the roofing family invested in all of the businesses in Fond du Lac. I know people don't realize that the roofing family at one time owned Giddings and Lewis. And so it's those little things that I want to talk about and tell people a little bit more of their investment in the city. Then I ended up with a big collection of stories about the sawmills, the lumber mills in Fond du Lac, from one end to the other of the Fond du Lac River. At one time in the early days was just all sawmills and sawdust. There's one guy who just called Fond du Lac as houses sitting in a nest of sawdust. That's how he described his hometown where he was born. My fourth collection section in the book is all about the railroad business. Fond du Lac is a hub of the railroading in this part of the state and the struggle for the early railroads to get established. And then my final section is about the biographies and events. My favorite story in this section is a lot of people have heard or thought that wasn't the state fair in Fond du Lac one time. Well, that state fair story is one of my favorites because they were here 1881 and 1882. The state fair was held in Fond du Lac. And the fairgrounds at that time was on Main Street. So I'll show you a little bit about that. The first part, the first early Fond du Lac includes a description of some of the Native Americans that were here. Also, I don't think many people realize how unique parts of Fond du Lac County is. There are only 2 places in the whole United States where you can see remnants of the Ice Age. One of them is here, east central Wisconsin, and the other place is northern New York State in the Finger Lakes region. Those are the only 2 places in the whole country you can see remnants of the Ice Age. That means the Tullamarine, Horicon Marsh, El Dorado Marsh, all Dundee Mountain. You ever been to Dundee Mountain? All of the gravel pits. Those are all remnants. Good old Mother Nature, or it's really a great attraction when you think there's only 2 places in the whole United States where you can see that. And so there's a lot. I'm just going to talk about a few things here. One of the first early Native Americans was a woman named Lucy Abner. Nobody knows her name, very few. She was a Native American from Brotherton. As a child, she came from New York with her family when the government was pushing the tribes west. She was part of that push from New York into Brotherton. But what is remarkable about Lucy is that at one point when the father of 2 of her children died, she, as a woman, let alone a Native American, was actually allowed to be their guardian and do the court process and sell the land left to them, which she was using to pay for their college education. Unheard of for any woman to be given this ability, much less a Native American. That's what's really outstanding about her. And then I'll have to add the side note. I'm thinking, they let her be a guardian, but maybe they left her alone and said, watch her fail, and she didn't. She was able to handle the sale and send her children. She was very, very education conscious. So all of her children, she had 10 children. All of her children went to college in that era, in the early days. And then, unfortunately, there's one other part that happened to one of her grandchildren that takes away the distraction from her because technically one of her grandchildren was the first quarterback of the Green Bay Packers. Now, here's the distinction because the Packer website says it was Curly Lambeau. 2 years before Curly became the quarterback, her grandson was the quarterback. At the time, they were a professional football team. Their first and second year, her grandson helped organize it. They were a professional team, but it wasn't until year 3 that they joined the NFL with Curly Lambeau. So the NFL only recognizes Curly Lambeau as their first quarterback and disregards the first 2 years. Another person of interest that nobody, this is people that nobody have heard of that really had ties to Fond du Lac. This guy's name is Pierre Paquette. And he's in Pierre, I do not know why Wisconsin doesn't have a Pierre Paquette Day. Because Pierre single-handedly is really responsible for the sale of land from the Winnebagos to the federal government so that people could settle in Wisconsin. He brokered the deal. He was the guy who went to all the treaty negotiations on the behest of Governor Dodge and Governor Doty. They would not go to treaty negotiations without Pierre. Pierre was born to a Winnebago woman and a French fur truck. So he knew French, he knew English, he knew Winnebago fluently. And so he did all the negotiations. But the government, whenever it pushes the tribes around or comes to a deal with the tribes, has one condition. Okay, we're going to pay X amount of dollars for your land, plus you're going to get an annual stipend, and we'll give you an allowance for clothing and trinkets and all this other stuff. But it only goes to full-blooded Native Americans. And Pierre wasn't. And Pierre had done all the work and made this whole thing possible. So the rest of the Winnebago went to Doty, Governor Doty, and said, Pierre, can't we give him some sections of land that are his and only his? And that's what Doty did. Pierre Paquette got 3 sections of land, 3 total sections of land. And then another section went to his son, another section went to his daughter, and another section of land went to their playmate, Carolyn Harney, who was also not eligible because her father was a white military guy who had deserted her. And so she wasn't eligible to get anything. And so Doty gave them 6 sections of land in total. And of course, he picked the foot of Lake Winnebago for all of those sections. So the eastern half of Fond du Lac, from the lake all the way, including South Hills, was all land originally owned by either Pierre Paquette, his son, his daughter, or Carolyn Harney. So half of Fond du Lac's original owner was this family. Unfortunately, Pierre never was able to step foot on the land because at the very last treaty, there was a very disgruntled Winnebago who assassinated him, claiming he did not translate properly, even though he didn't know any difference. He didn't like the deal, so he assassinated Pierre. And so his 2 children had a guardian appointed, even though their mother was still living. Women didn't count because they're too emotional. They can't handle stuff like this. They can't handle land. So they had a guardian appointed. The guardian immediately sent the 2 kids off to Indian school and then transferred the 2 sections into his own name. They never knew they owned this land until they were middle-aged. But they then took him to court and got their land back. So I think he needs to be remembered, even if it's just his small connection to Fond du Lac County. Don't even had a city named after him, after Pierre Paquette, but his handwriting was so atrocious. The people in Washington, D.C. couldn't interpret it, so the city is now called Poinet instead of Paquette. My favorite, or one of my favorite ladies in this is Lisa Lester. She came here as a little girl, 6 years old. When she arrived in Wisconsin, she was only 6, and there were only 4 houses in Fond du Lac. That's how early she came. Her dad was a nephew of Mason Darling. So that's why they arrived here. Her only playmates were Native American children, and she loved it because her mom would let her go in the spring and help them tap maple trees and collect maple syrup and do all of that. Lisa Lesser was also a practical joker. She was very, very intelligent and very precocious. One day she just happened to look over and wonder, I wonder what cats look like without any hair. So she took her father's strop razor and shaved her cat just to see what it would look like. She's intelligent enough, I believe she headed to St. Lawrence College when she was 14. And her family didn't want her going when she was that early. So they moved to Appleton with her. One of the pranks she pulled involved the university. One night, after everybody was in bed, she must have snuck out. She borrowed her mother's clothesline. And she borrowed all the neighbors' clotheslines, tied them all together, and then she went to the bell tower at St. Lawrence, tied one end of her rope to the bell rope, and then she went and took the other end, tied it to a calf that one of the professors was raising for veal. And in this era, you hear a bell ringing in the middle of the night, that means only one thing, fire. So every time that calf moved, the bell would go off. And people couldn't figure out what was going on. That was one of her pranks. She loved to play pranks. She is also, I'm not going to tell you why she got kicked out of college, but she got kicked out of St. Lawrence for another prank. But she eventually left then, and she started Wisconsin's first magazine, the Badger State Monthly. Unfortunately, this is a woman trying to live in a man's world. So she had to hire, doing a magazine, she had to hire typesetters. And they did such an atrocious job in typesetting. And I sometimes wonder if it wasn't deliberate. But she didn't really get the subscriptions that she had hoped for. So she taught herself how to typeset. And so then she also is known for hiring the very first first women typesetters in the state of Wisconsin. That was when she was working at the Milwaukee Sentinel. She also was she was an editor of a newspaper in Waupun for a while, down in Janesville for a while. Eventually, she moved to California, where once again, she hired the first women typesetters in the state. Very well known. Part of her actually she went to an acting summer school. And so then she would go and give presentations. She'd get up on stage and she would read either The Raven or The Charge of the Light Brigade. It wasn't any of her original work. She would just read other people's well-known work. And in California, she actually, I think it was 45 days in a row, she had a sold-out crowd. I mean, this was the entertainment of that era. Very, very well known. What she isn't as well known for is that she championed women's rights for anything and everything. You couldn't pin her down to one like like abolition, like women's right to vote or abolishing liquor. All of it, you couldn't pin her down because she was out there championing any kind of women's rights, where a woman wasn't treated as a first class citizen or a second class. At one point, she commented because she was performing in Salt Lake City, and her favorite thing to do was go and check out, of all things, the insane asylums. And so she called this Salt Lake City's biggest hidden story was the fact that they had so many insane asylums because any wife who would not go along with plural marriage, her husband would just put her in an insane asylum. That's how they did it. Salt Lake City's biggest kept secret is the number of insane asylums that they had at that time. So that's another person that really I feel has been left out of history for her connections to Fond du Lac. The second section that I have in my collection of stories is about the roofing family, not just roofing leather. There are a whole lot of businesses that the roofings were really responsible for either investing in, or at the time, Fred Roofing would get asked often. Somebody would come up to him and say, "Hey, I got a patent. I just invented this and I got a patent for an odometer for a bicycle. So now you can tell how many miles you've ridden your bicycle. Only I don't have money to start to manufacture it." And Fred would loan them the money. Fred was also savvy enough, if you came back a second time and said, "I need more money," he wouldn't loan you the money. He'd buy stock in your company so he could have a say-so, because the first loan should have been enough to get it going. But these are all the different companies that the roofing family, not just Fred, but the roofing family, like I said, they used to own Giddings and Lewis. They had a brewery. Oh my gosh. They had a brewery, brewing company, making money hand over fist. And then they moved it to Superior, Wisconsin. And after 2 years, Prohibition came along. No, sorry. They had it for about 5 years. Were making a profit, paying out dividends every year. And then one year they decided not to pay out the dividends to build a brick brewery instead of staying at their wooden one. So they spent $500,000 on a brick brewery in Superior. And the next year, the United States passed Prohibition. So they had their brewery 1 year, and then the following year, they sold it for $50,000 after putting in $500,000. So there were, there are circumstances that everything they touched was golden. Sometimes they lost their shirts. Here's one story of what they dealt with. When David Giddings was diagnosed with a terminal illness, he came to Fred Roofing and said, "Do you want to buy my shares?" He's settling his estate, taking care of things before he dies. And so he offered his shares. But Fred was busy with the leather company. And that was his thing. He didn't know mechanics as well. But Fred had a brother who was a mechanic and loved that part and was currently just serving as Ripping Leather's bookkeeper. And so his brother Henry jumped at the chance to buy David Giddings' share of G&L. Now, I know it wasn't a majority share. There were others, and they had a board to answer to. But by the time World War I came along, G&L was really on shaky grounds because whatever it was they were producing, somebody had invented something better. And so their sales were really going downhill, and they were facing bankruptcy if they didn't find something new to manufacture and sell. And they were looking at boring machines, but they weren't sure. They were just testing them out and trying them out. And along comes World War One, and England was looking for somebody to manufacture boring machines that would make munitions. England wanted was in a hurry because the war had erupted. And so whoever made the decision at G&L actually put in a bid and won a contract to furnish England with, I think it was 1,000, I'm not sure, 1,000 boring machines for $2,000 a piece. Unfortunately, nobody at G&L had the time to do a cost study to find out what it was going to cost them to make those machines. They were scared they were going to lose their shirts. By the end of the war, they realized, okay, they sold them for $2,000 a piece. It only cost them $800 to make them. So they made out like a bandit. But by the time the war was over, they were also mortgaged to the hilt to Fred Roofing. And so they were able to pay off all their debt and pay another dividend on top of it. But then they had decided they were permanently going to shut G&L. They didn't want to go through that again. G&L was going to close its doors at the end of World War I. And when Fred heard about this from his brother Henry, he was appalled. All he thought about at that time was all those men out of a job. They're going to all be laid off. And that's bad for the city. You got to have employment. You can't have the parks and all the other amenities if people aren't here and have a good job. So instead of them closing G&L, Fred bought the rest of the stuff. And to keep the doors open for the employees. And then when they really got into manufacturing these boring machines, found other uses for them. Another story about Fred. Fred was this great, I think he was a great forward thinker, great businessman, but sometimes there was one guy, his name was Julius Keller, that wasn't the greatest businessman, and Fred could not get rid of him for quite a different reason. I've always told, and I've told my kids this, you can be the best chef in the world, but that doesn't mean you know how to run a restaurant. You can be the best inventor in the world, but that doesn't mean you know how to run the business. So here's Julius Keller, and Julius had invented the first pneumatic drill that we still think of today. That was his invention, but he had the patent, the first patent for it. But he had sold his business and was kind of living off those proceeds, thinking that, well, he's going to invent a new and improved version and patent that, which you can do. And so he's coming to Fred for money to get this going. And Fred loaned him some money at first, but Julius is one of these guys who kept coming for more and wasn't producing anything out of this. And Fred couldn't get rid of him because also at the same time, Julius married Fred's sister. And he was using her money, her stock in the leather company as collateral for personal things and a few, And so Fred was afraid she was going to lose everything or that he was going to use her investment, her stocks in roofing leather, and bankrupt them. And his sister was going to lose everything. One example of how Julius did business was as he's trying to improve things, they're making this new drill that he was trying to design. And so he would just go on the shop floor and tell somebody, make that hole a little bit bigger, but he wouldn't go through the office and put in this as a change. So the tool and dies for making whatever he was making were never updated. They still had the old information, and he was always going behind people's back and not following the proper chain of command to make changes to his design. And then he added two of his boys on the payroll who sounds like they did nothing for their wages. And he just was going through money that Fred wasn't happy with. The end of this story is kind of the word karma comes to my mind because Julius had a third son who came to Fred Rooping and said, Dad and my brothers have this new scheme to make this new product, and there's no way we can make it. It's too complicated, and we don't have the means for making it, but they're determined to do this, and I don't want, and he's going to use my stepmother's money, and I know it's going to fail, and they're going to lose their insurance. But Julius, the son number 3, already had a solution to it because there was a company in Michigan that wanted to buy out their whole company where it stood. And he ended up getting his dad's permission to talk to them because the dad didn't think he could do this. He sold the firm, and the son came up with this clause, okay, Julius Keller, because this was your company and you're kind of a consultant, we'll pay you $5,000 a year. And there was a hidden clause saying, except you cannot step foot on the property. So to me, that's great karma. Next section is all about lumber, the lumber mills, and the businesses that sprang up because there was a lumber mill just down the street, like sash and door companies who could use the lumber, and then furniture companies, table manufacturers. Here are some of the topics that I collected stories on that I would find some unique story. We have Sexsmith Lumber Company was one of the first, if not the first lumber company in Fond du Lac. We have C.J.L. Meyer, Moore and Galloway, Fond du Lac Lumber Company. But we also have Fond du Lac Church Furnishings Company, Furniture Company, Winnebago Furniture Company. We have refrigerator companies. We have 3 refrigerators. And refrigerator means icebox in this time period, not electric refrigerator. But these were ice boxes called refrigerators. But we also had a beehive factory, a cigar box factory, and a toothpick factory in Fond du Lac at one time. As well as like the cable company where, you know, where the chimney still is on Scott and 45? The table company was there, run by the Roopings, by, don't think it was Henry Rooping, it was Lewis, maybe that was one of the Roopings. That was his company. C.J. Meyer is the biggest name in the early days of Fond du Lac for the lumber company. He was another man who was really a shrewd businessman because when he started his sawmill and then saw the price of logs, he thought, well, hey, I'd be better off if I bought the land where the logs were growing on and harvested them myself. And that's what he did. He bought land in the upper Michigan. And so he could go and harvest that timber from the land and get it down here to the sawmills. And then he had factories made. He had a lumber yard and then factories and then a furniture company. And then in the meantime, he invested some of his money in the railroads so that he could get things to market. And then when the railroads were finally connected to Chicago, he went and bought land out in Chicago and built a showroom to show off his furniture. So he had all the bases covered. And if you look at Western Avenue, that's all torn up right now, the whole north side of Western Avenue was his. That's where he had his mill further up the river, but he had his lumber yard, and then another great big factory building, and then a furniture company all along that strip up to the courthouse. Unfortunately, when he got older, he wanted to retire. And so when he retired, he turned over the business to his son, who had a gambling addiction. And within a couple of years, the whole kit and caboodle was bankrupt because he gambled all the way. So C.J. Meyer, who was Wisconsin's first millionaire, died of pauper because his son gambled everything away. Everybody kind of can remember Moore and Galloway as a lumber company that existed in Fond du Lac. But what most people might not be familiar with is that Moore and Galloway were first cousins, Marcus Moore and Charles Galloway. When Marcus Moore was 5 years old, his mother died. And so he was raised by his mother's sister, Mrs. Galloway. So Marcus Moore and Charles Galloway were really raised as brothers, even though they were first cousins. They were here in the era where the logging, where you sluiced the logs down for them, the Wolf River, they owned most of the land in 2 sections of Marathon County. Moore and Galloway, oh my gosh, you look at the early 1920 plat book, more than half of each section is Moore and Galloway. I know the area well because my 2 oldest children went to grade school in Galloway, Wisconsin, which is where they had all their lumbering operation. It's really interesting to read about when all these different lumber companies would, in the spring, all their logs came down the Wolf River. It stopped at Lake Poygan because at Lake Poygan they had this big boom area where each company sorted out and pulled out their logs. So what companies like Moore and Galloway did, once they had this big collection of their timber floating on the river, they would bind them all together into a big raft, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And what I didn't realize is they used tugboats to push the rafts down through Lake Winnebago to the Fond du Lac River. And it wasn't just Moore and Galloway. That's how all of the lumber companies at that time operated. So I've seen newspaper clippings in the Oshkosh paper in the spring, and it says which tugboat had 5 rafts for Moore and Galloway, 3 rafts of logs for Sexsmith. You know, they listed how many rafts were coming down into the Lake Winnebago to these different lumber companies. It's really something that I was totally unaware of that was common knowledge at that time. Pretty interesting to read some of that. The next section of all these stories that I've collected concerns the railroad and how railroading got started here in Fond du Lac. But I think when they started these railroad companies, I don't think they knew the magnitude of what it took to start a railroad company. These are the topics of all the different stories that I've collected, including the companies, the depots, the Belleville disaster, and also the businesses where I found stories that really relied on the railroad, like Sweet Wagon Factory and Steenberg Sash and Door, Northern Casket. Northern Casket had a catalog, and they had a map of North America, and they showed all the railroad lines to prove that they could get a casket to you anywhere in the U.S. and northern Mexico and Canada within 24 hours. That was one of their sales pitches. They showed all the railroad lines coming from Fond du Lac, and that was in that. They printed that in all of their catalogs. And they also printed a timetable of when all the trains left to the north, to the south, and when it was Chicago Northwestern, or when it was the Milwaukee Road, those trains leave this, and this. They had a full railroad schedule next to the map. Very, very interesting, just to prove you need a casket. We'll get to it.
Question. Wasn't the Sioux part of it?
Pardon?
The Sioux line.
Yes, Wisconsin Central and Sioux Line.
Okay.
Same name. Yeah.
Okay.
There were 3 main railroad companies that survived: Chicago Northwestern, and then Minneapolis, St. Paul, Sault Ste. Marie, which was Milwaukee Road, and then Wisconsin Central, Sioux Line. Kind of, then they changed back to Wisconsin Central, and then it's, yeah. But those are the main three that survived all the craziness. Let me tell you a little bit about the craziness. When railroads were first thought of for Fond du Lac County, it was usually a group of businessmen would get together, pool their resources, but it usually maybe was for like a 20-mile section of railroad. And they usually named it like Fond du Lac Waupun Railroad. That was the beginning and the end of the line. And all of these businessmen would get together, pool their money, and excuse me, it turns out they would start buying up land from the farmers where they wanted that line to go. Well, by the time they did all that, they ran out of money. So then they had to declare bankruptcy, and somebody else would come in and maybe take over, add more money to the pot, and then they would come in and level the land so you had a nice flat bed. But that cost so much, they'd run out of money, and then they would have to declare bankruptcy on the unfinished project and get more money. And every time they did that, the name would change because it had different investors in it. And then by then once it was graded, then you had to lay the track. The iron rails had to come from Green Bay. And eventually you would get a railroad. And also, the only way that railroad, even if it's 20 miles, would be successful is if they had freight. Ferrying people back and forth didn't pay the bills, but they needed the freight. And there was so much of the little startup, and then boom, down they went. Here's a little chart on how some of the early startups and who bought them out eventually. The three that survived are Chicago and Northwestern. But if you followed across, like Sheboygan and Fond du Lac started in 1846, they had to reorganize in 53 and became Sheboygan and Mississippi. And then eventually Chicago and Northwestern bought them out. So it's Chicago and Northwestern, or Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul would buy out the others, or Wisconsin Central, which was Sioux Line. So there was a lot of jockeying, a lot of changing hands for all of these railroads. The first time that there was a full railroad connection between Fond du Lac and Chicago, in case I never thought about it, but when they first started planning the railroads, they decided to take the railroad line around the west side of the Horicon Marsh. So we go almost to Waupun and come around and then head down to Janesville to Chicago. And that was one of C.J. Almeyer's gripes. He said, why did they bypass Milwaukee? So C.J. Almeyer helped to form the railroad company that went to Milwaukee through Eden, going that way. That was his brainchild. But once the first line connecting Fond du Lac to Chicago was completed, they had to have a big celebration here in Fond du Lac. So I think it was 24 passenger cars from Chicago came up to Fond du Lac for a grand celebration. And Fond du Lac didn't have enough hotel rooms at this time. So the Palmer House was the big, and only the women were housed then at the Palmer House. The men went to the armory and slept on the floor in the armory. And then they had a big gala dinner at the Palmer House. And then in the evening, they had a big dance. A band came up, part of the Chicago train, to play and furnish the music, some very renowned band. And then at the time, the city actually built a temporary walkway from the Palmer House across Main Street to Emery Hall, so that the ladies wouldn't have to drag their gowns through the Main Street mud. which I think Lisa Lesser called, uh, um, what did she call it? Street salad that you collected in your dress. Not just horse droppings, but street salad, whatever in getting through. So they built this temporary walkway just so the women wouldn't have to drag their gowns through the mud on their way through this. Unfortunately, a month later, Fond du Lac and Oshkosh did a return trip for a return celebration. And that's when the Bellevue disaster happened. The train on its way to Chicago hit an oxen that was on the tracks. And the train left the tracks, and I think it was at least 10 people were killed. Many of them prominent residents, prominent leaders in Fond du Lac. So that's one of the stories. My favorite in this section is the Hardcon Railroad War, which I don't think any of you have heard of. I never heard of it, but I would run across mention as I'm finding these stories, and it's like, I'm reading a story and it said, this reminds me of the Hardcon Railroad War. But then you didn't elaborate. And I think of, what Hardcon Railroad War? I need to know more. And I couldn't find anything. I just couldn't find anything until last year. And then I found a first person, somebody who was there during it, had written about what happened to him during this war. And what happens is it's another bankruptcy, but there were two mortgage holders, first mortgage and second mortgage. First mortgage holder lived in Chicago, and the second mortgage holder were all the farmers that the railroad track went through, because when this company was started, they didn't buy the land, they gave them stock in the company. And suddenly, when the company couldn't pay the mortgage, all of these farmers got a letter from the bank saying, you owe this payment, which blew up because the farmers were not happy, obviously. And so we have two mortgage holders. One went to federal court to file a bankruptcy, and so that judge appoints a receiver, and it's the receiver's job to take possession of any saleable assets to pay off whatever they could have the mortgage. But then the second mortgage holder went to a state court, and they appointed a receiver to collect and sell off all the assets. So you had two receivers locking horns over, I'm in charge of this, I got possession of this depot, no, we're in charge, we got possession of this depot, and the fight was on. But then we make things worse. While those two are fighting, the guy who originally started the line, the railroad line, decided, oh, while they're busy, I'm going to take charge of this depot. And, possession is 9/10 of the law. So we got three people fighting over all this. The one receiver took possession of the depot in Berlin. And the other receiver at first was in Waupun in their depot. And then I believe he moved to Hardcon. But each one of them would look and watch the track to see if one of the other ones was sending a train down the track. And they had Civil War cannons because the Civil War was over and some of them were brought home. Very strategically placed so that you know what's going to happen if there's a train coming down that track. They had their cannons ready. That was the Hardcon one. But the one group was in the Hardcon depot, and I don't know who it was, must have been Dodge County Sheriff, had heard that the U.S., a government ship had just landed in Milwaukee. So he called them up. He said, come up to Hardcon, they have a war here. I can't imagine sailors coming up and saying, put down your arms or we're going to fire. But supposedly that's what happened because they surrendered on the spot, probably because they were the federally appointed receiver and his friends. So they really were the ones who should have been taken care of. And that's how it was settled. The federal receiver was acknowledged as the rightful person to sell off all the assets. And that was the end of the war. They surrendered and it got resolved. But it's very interesting to read the details of this fight. And that. At one point, there was a big fist fight between all three groups that sent one guy to the hospital very seriously injured. So a fun story.
And do you have all those details in your book?
Yep. Yes. Yes. Here's Henry Wickham. This is a guy that I really think it's a shame, unless, of course, I haven't been to North Fond du Lac lately. Maybe they have a plaque somewhere. But between 1875 and 1900, a lot of businesses left Fond du Lac. Other cities had caught on to the move your company here and you won't have to pay taxes for 5 years. And so LaBelle Wagon Works moved to Minnesota. All of the McDonald companies that were here in town making the great big farm threshing machines, they moved to Minnesota. We were losing businesses and going downhill. And when I look at the statistics, Fond du Lac's population really dropped between 1875 and 1900, downhill for the first time. Fond du Lac was dying. When there are no jobs, people are they're going to leave town. Along comes Henry Wickham, was president of Wisconsin Central, convinced his board to close their shop in Stevens Point, close their shop in Waukesha, build a new shop on this 200 acres that he had just bought north of Fond du Lac. And they did. He saved Fond du Lac. And nobody knows his name. That was the kids doing. There were no houses at the time. Everybody that worked there lived in Fond du Lac. Fond du Lac quickly got on the ball and extended their trolley into North Fond du Lac, so at least the men had a way to get to work. And then, of course, you think of all the builders who suddenly had to build a whole lot of houses in North Fond. So he saved Fond du Lac from a pretty bad time. Final section in my book is events and biographies. This is kind of my favorite because it has a lot of fun stories in it. We have lead poisoning in the whole eastern half of Fond du Lac County in 1860. Between 300 and 400 people were seriously ill. Between 12 and 15 people died. Mostly children died from lead poisoning, and they didn't know what caused it until a doctor, Dr. Carey from Greenbush, was treating a lot of people in the town of Forest. And as he was coming out of the room of one of his patients, he happened to look up and see a loaf of bread sitting on the windowsill. And he saw something glinting in the dough. And that's when he walked over and saw there was white lead in the dough. And I'm sure then he asked her for, where's your flour sack? And found it there. And then discovered that she had gotten her flour from the mill in Dotyville. The doctor immediately hired someone to ride a horse through the whole area to tell people to stop using the flour. And then they went to Dotyville. Now, at this time, you have to realize grindstones used in the mill are not perfectly smooth as silk flat. There are little divots and holes in it. And it's always a miller's job to just clean those holes out from any wheat or oats that didn't get ground. But in Dotyville, he had an assistant who would fill those holes in right leg. And so every time they made flour, they were making flour that had lead in it. And it killed 12 to 15 people. The state fair, as I said earlier, state fair was actually a traveling fair in the beginning. So in 1881, 1882, state fair was held here in Fond du Lac. This is a picture of the fairgrounds. It's the Fond du Lac Stock Growers Association race grounds. They had a racetrack. It's on Main Street. And the other day I was heading south on Main Street and I stopped at 13. And then I looked to see how far the Dutch Gap was. Holy cow, that was quite a ways away. All that area was open farmland. And that's where the fairground was. I cannot believe, okay, think of it. A big field like that there on Main Street. Then I find the list of how many exhibits, animal exhibits there were. There were over 600 horses. 600 horses at the state fair. Over 800 cows. And then we have 400 pigs, 300 sheep. That's phenomenal. For that time, to have that many animals. And before the fair, there wasn't even water on this piece of property. So the city then had an artesian well drilled, and then they piped it to building sheds that they were putting up for the animals so that the animals had water. And then they had a fountain also for the people to drink this great medicinal water, artesian water.
Why did they call it the Dutch Gap?
Is this where the Germans all lived, right?
No, Deutsch from, yeah, I think the Germans were that.
Germans were Deutsch.
Deutsch.
So they called it Dutch.
So they called it Deutsch and everybody heard it as Dutch. But it was German, not Dutch. But it's still called it Dutch.
But didn't they build it originally for flooding?
Yes, it originally was done because where the fairgrounds is today, that used to flood all the time. So it was originally done to drain where the fairgrounds is now over to the river. Now you also, I'm reminded because my kids used to be in 4-H and exhibit at the fair. We always have, the state fair is coming, it's gonna rain. The first state fair here, it rained every single day. Now the fair, this is Wisconsin Agriculture Center. The fair originally was really farming, and it was held Monday through Friday, and there were no alcohol sales because it's a family event. Monday through Friday, and and the big feature is horse racing. That's what everybody came for, bet on horses. By Friday, they had to cancel all the horse racing because the racetrack was still partially underwater because of all the rain. And then Friday afternoon, when the sun finally came out and they finally got people to come to the fair, they actually held the fair an extra day. They kept the fair open on the Saturday so that people could come in and see all these exhibits. I have a list of all the exhibits in the book that I have too. It's really, really kind of astonishing that this first fair. One of the letters that I found in the newspaper concerns a letter to the editor that somebody had written saying, hey, somebody better do something about Main Street from 5th Street down to the fairgrounds. It is in the most atrocious condition. All it is 2 ruts where the wheels are capped by a little hill. And if somebody has just eaten dinner and they've had liquid to go with it, that sloshing around is going to pitch them in the ditch. It's like, you can't make up those kind of stories. I have to put that in the book. I have to say that story. Another story about the first state fair was happening during a time there was a big disagreement in Fond du Lac County because our rickety old wooden courthouse needed replacement. It was almost 40 years old, falling apart, and they kept trying to have a referendum for the county to build a new one. And they actually said the people in the western part of our county will not approve a referendum. So please forgive our rickety old stately courthouse. However, if you want a souvenir of the state fair, why don't you go visit our courthouse and chop off a piece of wood for a souvenir? So those are some of the fun stories that I found. This is one of my favorite stories.
One more quick question. What's there now? Where that used
All
to be?
houses. I mean,
14th Street in,
13th Street, 14th Street, 15th Street. Well, and
that's where I live.
this is the area I already talked to you about the lead poisoning. This is the area. A lot of confusion happened. A lot of confusion happened when they talked about Leonard's Mill in Jodyville, and one story confused it with Leonard's Pond. People said, no, that isn't where it came from, and it was, even though they're both owned by the same guy. Another person that really deserves a little bit more recognition. We still have Mercury Marine operating in this city, and Carl Kiefer doesn't get much recognition. He used to boast to his classmates that he could go from one end of the barn to the other without touching the floor, and he would run across the tops of the cows' backs. My favorite story about him is Carl Kiefer was pretty strict, and if he's paying you for 8 hours of work, he wanted 8 hours of work. You don't visit with your neighbor. So everybody knew that. And one time when he was walking through his factory in Cedarburg, everybody's at their machine except one guy, and he's just standing there drinking a soda. So Carl walks up to him, made a beeline for him, walked up to him and said, how much money do you make in a month? The guy told him. So he pulls out his wallet, Carl, peels off, here's 3 months' wages. You're fired. He had just fired the guy who was there filling the soda machine. Another thing you might not know is Carl came from a very strict German family. And it's the tradition, oldest son takes over the farm. And they knew by the time he was 8, he was a mechanical genius. And when he wanted to buy there was a Ford Motor Company in Cedarburg, he wanted to buy it. And his father told him, if you walk out that door, don't ever come back. So his father disowned him. And off he went. Because he knew machinery more than he wanted milk cows. Bill Hooker is another one of my favorites. He's written a book called The Bullwhacker. You might want to look it up. At 14, he became one of these drivers of these long supply trains that supplied the forts out in the West, Fort Fetterman, Fort Laramie. They needed supplies before there ever were settlers. And so he opened up the state of Wyoming. His tracks were the first tracks into Wyoming. And so Wyoming considered that he's the guy who opened their state up for settlement. And they made this monument to him right at that spot. Another surprising thing is I started thinking I was going to have a short little list of streets whose names had changed. I have a 4-page chart in the book of all the streets. But my favorite example is South Street. At one time, Fond du Lac had 2 streets named South Street. North South Street and South Street. And may I remind you, this is when women couldn't vote, women couldn't do anything, couldn't own property. So guess who made those kind of decisions? The picture showing how Jack Benny got to the theater from the railroad depot. He rode on the handlebars, and he liked his ride so much that he asked to have another ride just to show him around the city. I can't imagine being told, this is Cleo Smith, who later on had a dance studio. They're both 18 at the time. He was told to go to the railroad depot and pick up Jack Benny, bring him to the theater. So he hopped on his bike and brought Jack Benny back on the handle. So that's the story of my book. And some of the forgotten stories is indexed. And I actually have 2 pages of trivia questions in the back. But I also took a little liberty with a couple of the pictures just to see if anybody's paying attention. There are a few maps in the book that might have had a little addition made to the Fond du Lac River. So, just in case. So thank you.
Was that again?
Yeah, just let again. So thank you very much.